Okay, so now we need to get down to it. So you're very honored to two gentlemen with us today that are running for position in Congress, CB1. And I'm going to turn off the microphone to Dave, and he will go over details about what we're in this evening and introduce our speakers. So thank you, everyone, for being here.
See you. 4 minutes, 1 is first. I'm the student.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Dave Henson. I do enjoy this job. I don't know why, but I really do. Our two speakers today are the two candidates for the Democratic candidates for Congress in our district, District 1, Chris Gallant.
Dave, put your mouth closer to the microphone, lift it up.
Chris Gallant.
There we go.
And Lucas Ventures. I have to tell you, I've got new respect for these people who are running for office. It takes a lot. And I didn't really realize until I started looking a little bit more closely from the outside, getting involved with the North Brookhaven Democratic Club and oftentimes as moderator. It takes a lot of work, and they really do want to make a difference. I think there's both sincere in their desire to make our world better, and particularly our community. So I just want to recognize that. We're going to give each candidate 4 minutes to have an opening remark. You don't have to use the whole 4 minutes. Our own Chris will be timing things. Green means you're okay, yellow means you don't have too much longer to go, and red means you have to stop talking, okay? And then I've got, after the opening remarks, after each candidate introduces themselves, I have a series of questions that are in categories, and I hope to cover everything that's of interest to you guys, okay? Chris, why don't you go first? Chris, go first.
Sure.
Introduce yourself. 4 minutes.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to the North Brookhaven Democratic Club for having this event. And I do apologize for my absence last time. As you might know, my dad happened to be in the hospital, and so I was unable to attend. Family always does come first. So I think that's important. So a little bit about me and my background, for those of you who might not have heard me. One of my favorite quotes in American history, JFK in his inaugural speech had said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." And it is an ethos that I've lived by for pretty much my entire life. I watched the World Trade Center drop, and I was in middle school, and in high school, I watched us invade Iraq and decided it was at that point that I should join the military and do my duty to my country. So I did. I became an air traffic controller in the Army National Guard. I deployed in 2012 to Kuwait, and then later on I decided to become a Black Hawk helicopter pilot. I currently still serve as a Chief Warrant Officer 2, about to be a CW3. I deployed again 22 to 23 and flew missions everywhere from Syria to Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and UAE. One of the most interesting places to fly for sure, because air traffic there is definitely not any good. Stateside, I actually was welcomed on to do several missions here. I worked with the Secret Service after the Trump assassination attempt, flying missions up and down the eastern seaboard, protecting all the presidential candidates at that time. The Javits Center, I worked at the Javits Center during COVID. I was a safety officer for the Unified Command there. Essentially built the largest field hospital in the history of the United States overnight. And then I also was over here helping drop water buckets on the Gabretsky Airport when we had the local brush fire that happened. That's my military career sort of in a nutshell. On the civilian side, I was an air traffic controller. I joined the FAA in 2014. I was a local union president at 2 facilities at Northeast Philadelphia, Republic in Farmingdale, and then my final facility was at JFK, JFK Tower. I was a union leader there. I still actually am a member of that union. It is something that I strongly believe in. I love my career as an air traffic controller because, well, it was probably one of the most unique jobs you could ever be a part of. On a volunteer basis, I've been a volunteer firefighter since I'm about 16 at several different facilities. I'm currently at Copeg Fire Department. I've been there for 8 years. I even was able to work some fires out on Fire Island. I'm also the junior vice commander of my local VFW and a member of the American Legion. So my career and everything that I've done has been dedicated to service not only to my community, but to my country as well. And I think that's important. I've always had the aptitude to give back. And it's what I want to do here. It is now time to just change the uniform and fight for something else, because right now Washington is broken. I've watched what this administration has done. I've seen Donald Trump execute executive order after executive order that, in my opinion, was completely unconstitutional. And it goes against every fiber of my being. And we need people in Congress to start stepping up and fighting back. Because right now, Congress has the lowest approval rating ever. We need people in Congress right now that are going to fight. I've watched Donald Trump sit there and make a slush fund. We've all watched it. Finally, somebody stepped up. We had a judge step up that has actually paused that. And hopefully that stops. But it's everything. It's what this administration has done. We've gone to war with countries that nobody in America wants to go to war to. The president has the lowest approval rating in history. And so we have a representative here in New York 1, Nip LaLota. I thought I got 4 minutes, I apologize. Oh, my bad. Anyway, we're gonna fight every single day, and we'll talk about Nip LaLota later on. But
thank you everybody for being here tonight. I'm reminded by everyone's presence how much work maintaining democracy takes, and everyone's presence here is indicative of the fact that we all want to do that work. And so I'm very thankful for that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lucas Bentoris. I'm a 25-year-old first-generation American. I'm very proud of my Greek heritage, and I'm very proud of living in a country made of immigrants. Since I graduated high school and since I was a young man, I've always wanted to give back. And so I've worked on a lot of campaigns, political campaigns. I've worked in a congressional office. I've worked in civil rights law. I've worked in journalism. I've done organizing work. All of these things are me wanting to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. But when the time came, I realized that, we needed a new vision for our Democratic Party in Suffolk County. I've worked on a lot of these campaigns. I've seen great people and great candidates lose at the final finish line because the messaging wasn't right and the strategy wasn't right. And I've been felt so disappointed and dejected by that, especially as a young person, because I'm seeing Democrats lose their grip on power in places where the reality is we are a 50-50 district. And we are now being treated by the national media and the national political apparatus as a MAGA ruby red district. And I'm trying to flip us back into sanity. I'm running because I think that we need to have intentional and specific candidacies and campaigns that run on actual policy. I want to see Medicare for all. I want to see a child tax credit. I want to see paid leave for parents and also sick leave. I want to see us materially work for and with the working class. When democratic politics stopped centering itself on the working class in the 1970s and we went in the corporate route, and we allowed our party to be taken over by special interests and people who don't have the working class's best interests at heart, we lost our way and we began to lose elections. And I, for one, can't stand for that. I can't stand to see more people in our generation leaving Long Island, because Long Island is an unaffordable place with no hope for political representation that will actually bring us back to where we need to be. And that is exactly the reason why I'm running. I am running because it's good enough to say that we need to work on an affordability crisis, but it's better to say how we are going to work on an affordability crisis. It's better to say exactly what we will do, how we will do it, and why we want to do it. And as I said, once we stopped centering our politics on the working class, we began to lose. Democrats need to go back to the working class. They need to go back to linking arms with unions and mothers and fathers and grandparents, making sure that we have the best strategy and the best interests in mind for the working class. This is why I'm in this race. I understand, I'm a young person, and people might say, how can this young man understand everything that we need, and how can he carry this massive burden? But that is why I've been in every single inch of this district, talking to every single possible person I can talk to. Why a campaign that started with just me and my girlfriend and $20 has turned into a candidacy in a campaign that is a viable option to flip this district. That wasn't done because of me, Lucas. That was done because myself and the passionate people who sank their beliefs in me have done the hard work of listening to people, traversing the district, talking about the issues that matter most to people, but also knowing what we don't know, having the humility to listen and not talk, and making sure that when I came into this race with a defined set of ideals, that I acted on those and I articulated those with passion that people could understand that I'm an authentic person and I am an authentic candidate who wants to be an authentic legislator. And I say all of this to say that this is the most humbling process and thing I've ever done in my life. Obviously, I'm a young person, so I have a lot to do. I want to have kids, and that'll be far better and more humbling, but, you know, I'm sure of it. You know, that's what my parents tell me, at least. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, I'm proud to serve as a candidate and hopefully as your next congressman. Thank you.
Lucas, I'm going to have you go first on this. I'm going to alternate. Okay, guys? If you were to make a job description for the position of congressman, what would you include? What would it say?
So what would the stipulations be, or what would the role be?
What would the job description be? If you kind of posted in,
Sure.
you know, Indeed.
Yeah. So the job description would be, you know, obviously someone who needs to write policy, someone who needs to have people in their office who are constantly taking in information about what's going on a day-to-day, you know, basis in America, and making sure that the policy we put forward in terms of bills we either sponsor, co-sponsor, have a hand in writing, or at the very least voting for, are in line with what the working class of Suffolk wants. But, you know, I see a far more broad and expansive description for what the job needs to be. You know, you need to be, for everybody in the district that you represent, their ear and their mouthpiece for the federal government. Because God knows how many of our representatives don't actually speak for the people who are their constituents. They speak for the people who fund their campaign. And you know, I think that a person that runs for Congress needs to have campaigns that are funded by the people that they are supposed to work for. And so by doing that, you are unmoored from any other interests other than the interests of your, you know, proposed constituents. And the job description needs to be someone who constantly is having town halls. I'm proud to say I've had already about 6 town halls. They need to be someone who goes to community events. They need to be someone who goes to places of worship and places of education and places where people are living and congregating and listening. They need to be a person that is constantly advocating for what is important to their constituents. And what that looks like might be different to every person who's a leader, because leadership takes many different forms. But what it means to me is having a kitchen table approach to politics, that everyone has a seat at the table. There's always a slice of cake for everyone at the table, because to be a leader is a position that needs to be earned. And the only way that you can earn people's trust is by consistently showing up for them and advocating for the things that they believe in, and not telling them what they need and what they should be advocating for, because nobody knows people's situations better than the people on the ground. My mom always says the personal is political, and the biggest job of a representative is to listen to those concerns and act accordingly.
Thank you. Sure. What would your job description look like for position of congressman?
Say again?
What would your description look like for the position of job description of congressman?
So the name says it all, representative. That is what a representative or a member of Congress is supposed to be, a representative of our communities, the mouthpiece that goes to Washington and fights every single day for the conversations that we have here at home in our district. That is the purpose of representation. The purpose is to actually show up everywhere, at every moment, every waking moment, and every time that there's an event or something going on, or for you to be able to go and address that, and for you to feel heard. That's what a representative is supposed to do. Nicol Lota hasn't done that. Nicol Lota doesn't show up in our district. He doesn't listen. He doesn't pay attention to anything that's going on. And he's sat here and done nothing but be a rubber stamp to Donald Trump on a regular daily basis. Sure, he represents himself where he tries to tell us, I guess he tries to tell himself that he's a moderate, but his voting record tells a different story. His voting record, he's consistently voted in favor of anything that Donald Trump has said. That's not a representative. That doesn't represent us here in New York 1. That represents the broader overarching goal of this administration and the executive branch. My goal here is to show up. I have also held town halls across the district. I held meet and greets almost every other day. And it is those conversations that really dictate how my policies and platform align, because it's your voice that really is going to dictate how we vote in Congress in Washington at the end of the day. And that's what a representative should be.
Thank you, Chris. We all remember with horror the insurrection on January 6, 2021. We were outraged by it. That incident was somewhat reignited recently when Donald Trump offered not only to forgive them, but to compensate them for what he perceived wrongdoing by the public and the police to them. I'm not going to ask you whether you're outraged by that. I know you are. What I'm going to ask you is, what can you do to prevent it in the future? What changes can be made in the law and policies, whatever, to prevent that sort of outrageous behavior? Chris, you're first.
So we're talking about the $1.8 million slush fund, right? 1.8.
That's what we're talking about, yeah.
Just to be clear. 1.8. Anyway, so that's outrageous to me, because I can't imagine paying the people that Donald Trump was essentially let off the hook for doing what they did to our Capitol, and just paying them off for being quote unquote wronged by the government. That is completely unacceptable. And it is something that I would fight for every single day. And thankfully, I made my opening statement about it too, because I heard it on PR today, that there was a judge that has actually blocked that. And hopefully that stays. But what we need to do is, later on in Congress, we can actually pass laws and fight to make sure that no president is a king, and to make sure that no president can turn around and develop some kind of bill and slush fund to not only fund something of that nature, but also tack on all the stipulations that were in that bill. There's stipulations in that bill where now the Trump administration and his family are no longer being able to be assessed by IRS. That is completely unacceptable. This administration has done things across the board that are completely unconscionable. So my goal would be to pass laws that would make sure, in effect, that this could never happen again. At the same time, we currently have a Supreme Court that has almost allowed, or has allowed, the president to not be held accountable. This president needs to be held accountable for his actions, and those are the things that we will continue to do.
So part of the question that was asked is, how can we prevent another January 6th? And the way I interpret that is, how can we prevent another stop the steal, 4-month madness that we all endured? And the one thing that I think is really important is that we need to tighten up our election law. And we've seen laws that were passed even in the wake of January 6th, the Electoral Count Act, which was boosting our election security. But now we've seen in the second Trump term the subpoenaing of ballots from states like Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and the like. We've seen in the southern states basically watchdog, quote unquote, groups that have been set up to try and kick people off the voting rolls. We need to codify, whether that is a constitutional amendment would be ideal, but probably just through law, the fact that the federal government can have no say in the way that our states run elections. And what we've seen, and I think for a long time people advocated for a tighter federal control on elections, but now we've seen that a mad king, someone who has a vested interest in seeing themselves stay in power, can tamper with the functions and the guardrails that we have. And so we need to make sure that states have better and more secure autonomy with regard to how they run their elections. We cannot get to a point where we all in this room know that there was no actual room for interpretation with regard to the 2020 election. Trump lost that, cut and dry. But the fact of the matter is, he took advantage of loose parts of our system to try and feed propaganda and poison the minds of people who still to this day think that our elections were rigged. And what we need to do is codify into law stronger protections for our elections, and also make sure that the federal government can have no say. When the election is said and done, the codification is even more set in stone than the process that we already had. And we need to make sure that we do that. So there's no room for a potential insurrection again.
You answered that, Chris?
Yeah, because
Okay. Sorry. You both have vulnerabilities, both wonderful young men, but you have vulnerabilities. I want to address some of those the way I see it. Lucas, you're first. You're young. You know that. I'm sure you were anticipating that. They're good. The Republic, if you get the nod from the as the candidate for the Democrats, they're going to attack you when you're age. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to counter that?
well, I think if my age is the worst thing that I bring to the table, worst thing, quote unquote, then we're probably on good footing. Because, I think that it's very rational for people to say, this is a young man, as I said earlier, how can we understand that he can carry this burden? And I've partially proven that in building a campaign, despite everyone telling me not to, despite people trying to stand in my way, that resonates with people because of the power of my convictions and the passion which I articulate my positions. Now, that's one thing, but substantively, what am I going to say? I'm a young person, but I have achieved a lot in my young life. But, what I make up for, what I lack rather in this traditional 30 years of Beltway experience in some sort of firm, with the world around me being, more and more jaded and me being more jaded with it. I think that I bring a sort of youthful optimism to our potential legislative position that I think we need, not just out here, but in the Congress. We need young people who are articulate, who, and of course I have a vested interest in saying that about myself, but hopefully you all agree, that know their stuff, that can put forth policy that, as I say earlier, materially impacts people. My age is really a non-issue in that regard, because I could be 55 and, not really well-read, corrupt maybe, not really caring about the people. But the fact of the matter is I'm a young person who's put everything on hold. And I don't say this as a boo-hoo. I say this as, proof of the fact that I want to serve. I put everything on hold to make sure that the policies we're advocating for are the best for the working class. And the passion that we attack these positions is very, strident. And what I think is most important is that Lolota is going to say I'm young and I'm going to say he's corrupt. What would you rather do? A passionate and forward-thinking young person, or a mid and something age? And I think that's important that we look past the ageism in that regard.
Thank you, Lucas. First, people are gonna, or the Republicans in particular, are gonna attack you because you're gay. You know that? How are you gonna counter that?
That wasn't the question I was expecting, but okay. There's so many other things. Look, I was in the military during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I've dealt with those types of rhetorics. I don't care that I'm gay. Makes no difference. I'm not running a platform based on who I love at the end of the day. I am not afraid and I am unashamed of who I am. I've held my head high in many regards. I've been through the military, and being in during Don't Ask, Don't Tell and not being able to be who I was or who I am, it gave me a moment to pause and actually reflect on the ability that once Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, I was able to be myself. And the members of the military that I worked with every single day not only supported me, but looked up to me, because I've always been a strong person. I've always had the ability to bring people together. And today, the people that I work with look at me as an inspiration. And people who right now might be afraid to come out. I mean, this is Pride Month, so happy Pride to some of you who might be. It's the moment that when they look up to me and they support me, if the members of the military and the members of the fire department and the members who I worked with in the FAA as an air traffic controller all supported me, and at no point did I ever encounter adversity because of who I am, I don't care what the Republicans throw at me, it's not going to work.
This question might be two parts. I'm going to start with you, Chris. There's a narrow piece of land in the Middle East.
Which one?
There's a narrow piece of land in the Middle East. To the east is is Jordan. To the west is the Mediterranean Sea. North is Lebanon. And this piece of land is home to three major religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Do you refer to this land, first of all, as Israel or Palestine?
It is Israel.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on the Palestinian or on the Israeli-Palestinian situation? How can it be improved, rectified? How can they learn to live with each other?
I mean, I believe in a two-state solution. I believe in essentially a democratic way to actually develop. I don't believe in war. I don't think war is the answer to all problems. When Israel was attacked, we have an agreement with them as a country, and they have an alliance with us as well. And I've worked with them overseas. An attack on one country is an attack on the other, and we're there to support and defend. However, when we get into a situation where a war turns into humanitarian crisis and children are dying and hospitals are being exploded, it is at that point we have the technology and the ability to go forth and be more surgical and strategic in our strike to take out whatever enemy might be attacking them. Right now, Israel should be taking that moment and working on a democratic solution and working on a two-state solution. Those are the answers that I support. I support making sure that Israel and Palestine have a place to live and support them through that moment. But I do not believe in a war that creates a humanitarian crisis at the end of the day.
Do you want to repeat?
No, I think I got it. So the first part of the question was, what I call it. The parts that are the state of Israel, I call the state of Israel. The West Bank and Gaza, I refer to as Palestinian lands. And then, we also have occupied territory where the settlements are, and I don't think we can forget that, because that is occupied, disputed land. People refer to it in different ways, but I think that we shouldn't forget that those places exist. With regard to the conflict itself, what we are seeing are war crimes. What we are seeing is a humanitarian crisis, war-induced famine, military targets, which are really hospitals and schools and places like that, and we're seeing that people that in the Israeli government, like Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, these are people that have inherently, that has language that is inherently, war crimes. The way they talk about Palestinians is a dehumanization of them. And when you dehumanize people, what you allow yourself to do to them or are okay with happening to them becomes inhumane. And I think that we should not forget that. I don't think that the U.S. can be the arbiter of how peace is achieved in the Middle East and specifically in Israel and Palestine, because I think that there are too many people in our government who have a vested interest in seeing Israel, proceed with impunity. You have Jared Kushner that wants to create a Riviera on the sea in Gaza, and he will stop at nothing to see that occurs. And I think that's a big problem. And what I see and how I see peace is that we need to have an international organization. That means the Chinese, that means the French, that means the English, the Germans, everyone with a vested stake in our global, peace and the order of our global order. They need to have a vested interest in what goes on. We need to see some sort of buffer zone, a two-state solution, and the U.S. can't be the ones that are securing the place. We need to have a multi-cultural and multi-nation effort in securing peace in that region. It can't just be the United States and Israel. So that's what I believe.
Smart people, or at least academically accomplished people, overwhelmingly vote Democrat. And well, as evidence of that, I want to point out Stony Brook University, Brookhaven National Lab. But in fact, if you look at a map of the United States and how different areas voted, even if you get the most red state, there's always a little blue dot in it. And inevitably, that blue dot represents where the state university is smart people, okay? It's true. Yet, somehow we lose the popular vote. Somehow we don't connect with the populace. So maybe they've had the last laugh. Heard one person describe it as revenge of the sea stew. I don't know. Sounds okay to me. But my question to you is, why is that? And how can it be fixed? Chris, who's up for that? I forget.
Lucas, I think that's me. Just to be clear, that's your characterization of people. As future congressmen, neither one of us, that's not coming from, no, I'm kidding. But, you know, the reason I think that is because, you know, our educational institutions offer a place for people to express themselves. And oftentimes it will attract people who, for the first time in their lives, feel that they are in a place where they are accepted and they are welcome. And whether that is gender ideology, identity rather, who you love, what you look like, what you believe in. College campuses are oftentimes the first place in a young person's life where they're able to fully express themselves. I know that. I felt the same way coming from Suffolk and moving, to South Carolina and then New York City. I got to have different experiences, and that's really important. But what's really important as well is that academia and the message behind academia is not being lost from our working class message. And I fear that too many working class people see higher education as these elite, almost financial institutions where they don't have a place. And culturally, they can't be themselves. And some of that is true and some of that is not true. You have, right-wing agitators that want to push a narrative that college campuses are full of liberals. Well, I went to the University of South Carolina for a year. I'll tell you, not the case. From firsthand experience, this was during the 2020 election. I was probably one of 5 liberals I could find that would be open about it. And, why is that? Because, attaining an education is at this point such an out of reach financially task for so many people. I know, I am swimming in student debt from law school, as are many people. A lot of people, because they don't have the financial means and they don't feel accepted, feel as though educational institutions are not for them. And what we need to do as Democrats is make sure that our policies and our messaging is broadly palatable to working class folks, blue collar folks, students, professors, scientists, cops, lawyers, it doesn't matter who, doctors, it doesn't matter. Our message needs to be consistent, and we can't change the way we talk depending on who we talk to. People need to see the authenticity of our platform and the authenticity with which we articulate our platform. And that's really important.
What is the question?
So inevitably, smart people, or at least academically accomplished people, tend to vote Democrat.
Right.
Okay, and not by a little bit, by a lot. Okay. Yet, and that's broadly true across the country. If you look at the most red states, there's a dot of blue there, and inevitably it's where the college campuses are. Okay. So my question is, why, if the smartest people are voting Democrat, presumably they have the best answers to the problems that we face, why are the Republicans winning the popular vote in many of those places? And how could that be reversed? Well, you don't have to agree with it. You can say that's not true.
Well, no, I mean, it is true. I mean, right, it's just statistically true that higher educated people actually do vote in line with democratic means and ideas. But I mean, it could either be a gerrymandering question, or it could be, do we get rid of the electoral college question? Everybody deserves representation in our country across the board. Whatever their vote is, or whatever their thoughts or ideologies are all important. We may not agree with them. We may not agree with the other side all the time, but they do have a voice, and that is what this country and democracy is all about. There are several things, and I think I'm going to just get into the gerrymandering side right now. I feel that gerrymandering should never be a thing that should be done. Every part of this country should have equal representation across the board. At the end of the day, when we talk about what we're doing right now, or we're attempting to mid-century redistrict, is completely inappropriate. Yes, granted, the Donald Trump has decided to go after some states where he could gain some additional Republican seats. And the response to the Democrats was, okay, well, we can do the same and fight fire with fire. At the end of the day, however, we should enact laws and actually codify rules that don't allow something like that. We should really have an actual independent body that actually votes and focuses on how do we actually divide up our districts in order for them to be completely fair. Yes, I know that's a stretch and it's going to be very difficult to actually wind up doing, but those are things that I think we should fight for, and that's how we get equal representation in this country.
Andy.
We've all heard a lot in the news recently about the Electoral College and how maybe it needs to be fixed. What are your thoughts on the Electoral College? Is it fair? And if you don't think it's fair, what would you do to fix it? Chris?
So there's a lot of school of thought right now with actually getting rid of the Electoral College for, say, the presidential election and be more focused on a popular vote. I'm not necessarily against that. Right now, we've seen elections where the popular vote was higher and the opposite president had actually won the election based on the Electoral College. In my opinion, when we talk about a country as a whole, that is not a fair assessment. If you're going to win by popular vote, you should win the election. So it is something that it needs refining and more looking into. Actually, it was only recently I received that question in general, so I haven't dug real deep into an actual position on what my thoughts are. But I do think that there should be equal representation across this country, particularly when it comes to the presidential election, and that it does need to be reformed.
Thank you. Francie Kirk.
So I'm in favor of doing away with the Electoral College. I agree that the popular vote should decide who becomes president. I think that the Electoral College is such an archaic system, first implemented to help states vote easier when voting took weeks at a time. That was one thing. And then it became basically a way for slave states to have an edge in the presidential outcome. Now we are seeing that it is a completely archaic system. It is a system that makes absolutely no sense, and it needs to be abolished and done away with. And we need to have, as direct representatives and direct democracy, a process as possible where the people, no matter whether they're in Jackson Hole or Brooklyn or Sarasota or you name it, they need to have the same weight behind their vote. You can't have people in Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and, depending on how they feel down there, Florida, for the outcome of a presidential election. We have had presidential elections that have essentially hinged on the vote of 10,000 people. That is not representative of our democracy. Now, Trump won the popular vote last time. That was representative of what a majority of voters in this country wanted. But we've seen several times the Democrats are casualties because of a system that essentially favors minority rule and Republicans in gaining an edge. And I don't think it's right, and I think we need to do away with it.
Lucas, can you think of any issues in which your personal position deviates from the standard Democratic response? What are they and why? Or you agree across the board with the Democratic platform, you can say that too.
Well, I got this question at the last forum, and I'm going to kind of give the same answer. Sorry. I think that the way I differ from Democrats in a policy sense is that my rhetoric always matches my action. And so you have a lot of Democrats say that we need to overturn Citizens United and get dark money out of politics. Then you have these same Democrats taking money from the pharmaceutical industry, big ag, all of these things. We don't need to go down the list to give everyone a headache right now. And, that's where I differ. I've always posited that all of the issues that we have in our country are downstream of our corruption problem. Is that, when we have continuing in place a perverse incentive structure for politicians who can go to DC, go to Albany, go wherever, make a name for themselves so they can eventually cash in, meaning that their entire navigating of their political career has been, how do I best position myself for a payday, and how do I best position myself to help my donors rather than help the people who I'm supposed to represent. And so the way I differ from a lot of Democrats is, no more stock trading. I'm very firm about that. And Lolota came out recently, oh, let's do a stock trading ban, which is BS because we know he's number 6 in the House for enriching himself. So that shows you the messaging and the rhetoric of so many of these members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. That's where I differ. I don't think, as I said, you should stock trade. I don't think you should be able to become a lobbyist right after you leave office. That distorts your entire, as I said, life as a politician. And so the way I differ is that I need, or rather I want to see a financing system that doesn't only allow the elite and the people who want to make bank from their position be the only ones who can run for office. We need to open up our system so that truly working class, focused people and working class people can run for office and represent people in their districts. And I think that's probably where I differ.
Same question, I bet, right?
What's
So I think right now we're at a moment in time where we are so divided, and everything that goes on in this country on a daily basis is nothing but rhetoric, constantly. Every single day I wake up, I look at the news, and I think it can't get worse than it. Well, it does regularly. I look at it like this. We have Red Sox and Yankees fans, and they may not like each other, but they love the game. This country has lost the love of the game. So when we talk about how Democrats and Republicans work together, they're not working together anymore because we are so divided. Unfortunately, unless we have a real good sweep across the House, which is possible, and I could pray for it every single day, we do have to work with our counterparts in Congress to get anything done. Now, granted, a lot of my positions and policies are probably a lot further left than a lot of the Republicans that are currently sitting in Congress, particularly every single one of them that has continued to vote in line with Donald Trump. And that's everything that I'm against. However, we do have to start bridging the divide. And that is probably something that the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily want to hear all the time. But we need people in Congress that are going to start working together and start working on real solutions to real problems, because there are many of them. We need Congress to start enacting laws again and start working again. Congress hasn't passed anything in years, and it's only getting worse. They're at their lowest approval rating ever because we can't work together. And so it's something that I'm going to fight for, to make sure that we start bridging that gap, bridge that divide, and start pulling the rest of the country into our corner to work together and actually rebuild a new country.
Thank you. Having listened to both of your answers, if and when, with God's grace, we regain control of the House, the Senate, the executive branch, would you personally want to go after past transgressions for what they committed? Or will you just want to wipe that clean and move forward with more of a positive agenda? How important is it to you to go after past transgressions? Chris, you first.
We absolutely 100% have to hold accountable anybody who's currently in office or who's held a position of power and have done things that are illegal and that are against our Constitution and that are against the things that we stand for as a country. That is an absolute. However, we will not sit here and I will not nitpick on certain little things that are not relevant, because it's a distraction from getting the work done. Because again, like I said just a moment ago, we need to start working together again to build a brighter future, not only for us, but for our children, because they are our future. I don't want to leave my nieces and nephews a future that we have this nonstop divisive action going on. I look at our current administration and what the last couple of years have done, and it's lawsuit after lawsuit and hearing after hearing. I think we're tired of it. It's time to start working again and actually putting work in to things that are going to make sense. So that's what I would do. Yes, I would absolutely hold accountable people who have done things that are illegally and that are against this country. But we need to rebuild our future.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to not go after past transgressions. I mean, look at the last year and a half, which felt like 12 years. But the last year and a half, which has been pediatric cancer research cut, Meals on Wheels, cut. USAID, cut. Veterans benefits, cut. Money for healthcare, cut. Obamacare more broadly funding, cut. So many cuts and so many people who are left suffering because of Republican rule. These things need to be, talk about, Project 2029 when we win in 2028. That's not soon enough. We need to start doing the work, or at least laying the foundation for a Democratic president to more easily be able to get us back to, at the very least, day one of January 20th, 2025, when we have a new president. We need to get back to square one and then build from there. But the only way that we're able to prosper and grow is if we undo a lot of the damage done by the Trump administration. Another thing is the purposeful firing of immigration judges, making and muddying our immigration system and making it more difficult to navigate on purpose. We can't go forward if we don't fix a lot of the institutional damage that has been done. And I think that, you want to work with your colleagues always, right? But for 50 years, half of my prospective colleagues and their ilk, the politicians that is, not the voters, have been showing people that they don't care about the working class and they don't want to work towards working class issues. Whether it's the immigration bill that Trump killed when he wasn't even in office, whether it's, ways that we can expand healthcare access or coverage. These are all things that have been basically trampled on during this first year and a half of the Trump administration. And should I be lucky enough to be your next congressman, I will work really hard, both educating the people on what needs to be fixed and trying to lay the groundwork internally for us to fix these things, both in the near and both in the short and the long term.
Lucas, as we were mentioning everything that was cut, to my mind came the fact that Trump found money to build some big ballroom in the White House and a mixed martial art amphitheater on the South Lawn of the White House. Wow. Incredible. When the Democrats regain the House, pretty good chance Hakeem Jeffries will be the Speaker of the House. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, I am. I mean, there are definitely going to be things I want to see from him, but I'm perfectly happy to work with him. I think, I will vote for him, but my vote, not like, I'm going to hold my vote and you're not going to become Speaker, but I think my vote will be contingent upon the Democratic Party moving more towards working class issues and not forgetting districts like ours, because it's not a rural district, but it's oftentimes treated like an afterthought, both in Albany and in DC. And I want to make sure that any, vote I go, whether ceremonial or otherwise, to the Speaker, lets him know that I'm not here to last a term or two and just help you become Speaker. I didn't get elected to help you become Speaker. I got elected to help the people of Suffolk County. And, I'd be happy to make him Speaker or help make him Speaker. But the fact of the matter is, should he be our Speaker, he needs to know that there needs to be a new sheriff in town. And I will do everything in my power to communicate that to him and make sure that I'm a positive thorn in his side, because I think the leadership of the Democratic Party kind of needs a kick. That's pretty much the biggest understatement of my entire candidacy so far. But, I'm not there to burn the whole thing down. I'm there to work with who's there to make America a better place. But, hopefully Speaker Jeffries needs to know that I won't be one of the quiet members of the caucus. And when I vote for him, I'm going to be happy to fight.
Will you be okay with Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker?
So, actually, this is not the first time that I was asked this question. Actually, it was very much so at the very beginning of when I decided to run for Congress, if I would support Jeffries in becoming Speaker. I haven't seen any other candidates or people that had been interested. I think, though, whoever does become Speaker of the House needs to make sure that they hold that position of power with just that, with a position of power where they control a lot of things that happen and occur on the Hill daily. And sometimes I feel Jeffries doesn't always have that strength sometimes. So would I support Jeffries? Absolutely, I would support him. But if there's a better candidate that comes along that says that they want to step up to that position and they show strength and the ability to fight what's going on right now, because if we do win in 26 or this year, it's going to be 2 years of hell dealing with the executive branch of the government. So we need somebody that's ready to stand up and to fight every single day in that position, because it's really going to be on them. We are going to support them as a body in Congress, but the speaker is the head, and you need strength in that position.
Maybe. One of the bigger problems in the United States, but particularly Long Island, is the housing situation. It's just outrageously expensive to buy a house now, particularly for young people. How will you address that problem? How will you try to make things better? Chris?
Well, I think I said it earlier. I have 9 nieces and nephews of all ages. Some are in middle school, high school. 2 of them are in the military. A couple of them are in college. And I look at their ability to try and leave the nest, to afford college, and then afford a house. Houses right now, median household price is $800,000 on Long Island. How does a child who leaves fresh out of being home with their family, not making any money, afford a down payment on that? The average age right now of a first-time home buyer is in the mid-40s, which is about 20 years later than it was just 20 years ago. So there are options that we have that we can put forward. First off, I would say that if you are going to college, there should be tax incentives, tax write-offs, help with college, help with education, help with housing, because our children are currently being priced off of Long Island. I look at it in the fire departments. Fire departments right now are struggling to keep volunteers for several reasons. First of all, some of them are having to maintain 2 jobs at a time. They don't have the time. Then when we look at something like Shelter Island, where kids leave Shelter Island and they are not coming back, the median household price on Shelter Island is $1.4 million, $1.6 million. They're not going back there. So the average age of the fire department in Shelter Island is about 60 years old. It's a problem. So right now, housing is a serious crisis. I would be pulling federal funding and to work towards more affordable housing, to make sure we hold accountable corporations that are going to price gouge against the. I would work towards making sure that we go against corporations that price gouge people who actually require those affordable houses, and making sure that we get the money into the pockets of the builders to actually build new homes, because we need them.
Thank you.
Well, I look at housing affordability as you either own or you rent, and both facets have glaring problems to them. So I'll start off with, if you're a renter. I'm a renter. I live in an apartment, and open and raise my rent again. But the fact of the matter is, they can raise my rent. It doesn't really matter. Whether if you're a big holding company, you own a lot of property, your rent needs to be capped at a 2% increase per year, or it needs to be indexed with rising wages. That's very important because we need to protect all people in all living scenarios. Now, if you go to home owning, you have private equity that buys up our housing stock. You have predatory lending practices, which you can get your dream home, but it's going to be the last thing you do. You will be tied up in a generational amount of debt just so you can kickstart your life in your mid-40s when you probably already have kids. It's not exactly the rendition of the American dream that we were all taught. You get a good job, you buy a house, you have 2 cars, 4 kids, white picket fence, and you go on a yearly vacation. That doesn't exist anymore, especially not on Long Island. And, you need to make sure that, when it comes to affordable housing, we overturn the Fair Cloth Amendment. It allows the federal government to actually go in, build more housing units, and spend more money on housing. Right now, they're actually limited in their ability to do so. Not a lot of people know that. That's a substantive thing that we need to try and repeal before the federal government can go in and start building houses en masse. When it comes to money that I will bring into the district, your congressman kind of needs to play hardball with a lot of these Republicans out here, especially people who are tied up in the development industry. We're saying, you can't just keep using federal dollars to build things that are not practical, that are not increasing both the amount of people who can live in an area, but also the affordability of the houses where people can live. It's ridiculous. And we need to see a federal representative step in and say enough is enough of both these predatory practices from financial institutions and otherwise, but also locally in zoning laws. You need a congressman to play hardball and say, build multiple family housing units, build affordable housing units, or else. And that's really important.
Lucas, you mentioned that you rent, at least currently you rent. Does it bother you that you can't take that as a tax deduction?
Honestly, I haven't really thought about that much, to be honest, because
Obviously, on your behalf.
no, I know. It's not something that I've thought much of. I'm fortunate enough to be a candidate whose living situation is far more akin to the people who he seeks to represent than I think a lot of our previous candidates, or rather nominees, have been. Because I'm sure there have been lots of working class candidates like us. But the fact of the matter is, I don't even think of stuff like that, because for me, it's, can I find a place? Can I find a place that allows me to have a pet? For Christ's sake, I want to have some sort of companionship in my life. And half the places don't allow pets. They don't allow dogs. They don't allow cats. They don't allow sneezes. They don't allow fun on Sundays. They don't allow anything. And, the fact is that, it's actually a good question. And it's one that I'm sure it's going to keep me up now about this, actually. Never even thought about that. But, I just want to say that I'm fortunate enough to be able to relate to the people I want to represent far more than it takes so much money to run for Congress. I've put some of my personal money in, and I've raised a lot of grassroots money in this district. I haven't been able to throw millions of my own dollars into this, or have millions of dollars from benefactors or people that I know, and that's that kind of takes you farther away from the people than being a renter with 2 dogs in a tiny apartment, which is carpeted, much to my chagrin, and is just like, it sucks. But I do think it's a good question. I don't know if I have the perfect answer for that, but I do have a very earnest answer of, I don't know. I just feel like it makes me a lot more relatable, probably.
Fair enough. Chris, should rental fees be tax deductible?
Absolutely. Why not? Because, you look at, oftentimes when people rent, they're not investing money into a property. When homeowners have the opportunity to actually go forth and buy a house, which for many people is extremely difficult, they are investing in something that will turn around years later and pay them back. Renters don't have that luxury. They don't get anything back out of renting. They are merely dumping money into a property, and they are paying for whoever owns that to essentially own it. My position, I've been very fortunate. I bought my house in 2015 for $189,000 at a mortgage rate of 3.5%. Where are you going to find that right now? You're not. It's impossible. So that's a benefit that I have right now. And I've discussed it several times. One of the biggest issues that people have with where I live right now, because I live in Amity Park. It's no secret. But I'm considering moving into Smithtown or Northport or St. James, right? Now to actually move, it's the affordability is the question. Interest rates aren't 3.5% anymore, they're 6%. Plus, or they could be going up by the time we actually move. My partner right now, who's deployed overseas, when he comes back, we're going to decide on what we're going to do and move. Win or lose, I'm moving because he wants a bigger property, so we have to move. But the idea is that we have an idea where we want to live. But a house that was $189,000 in 2015 isn't going to get me to the point to buy a new one just yet. It's going to be difficult. There's going to be a struggle, but it's going to be worth the struggle. But when we look at renters at the end of the day, they need to get some kind of kickback, and the federal government can provide that.
Right. This next question is from one of our members, and I'm just going to read it because I'm not sure how to summarize it, but it's about unions. I'm retired now, but I spent 26 years working for the Longwood Central School District as a member of the Middle Island Teachers Association, or MITA. My union fought for our benefits, our salary, our working conditions, class size, and health insurance upon retirement. My membership in the New York State United Teachers Union has fought for a decent retirement system, state funding for our school districts, among other priorities. New York State Teachers Union represents over 700,000 professionals. Democrats ask for a union endorsement, but I have noticed there's no union bug on the lawn sign showing union members produced this product. Why not?
Well, I can tell you right now that anything that I have ever produced has had a union bug. My lawn signs have union bugs. My flyers have union bugs. Anything that I've ever had printed has union bugs. As a matter of fact, I was just recently in a meeting with 1199, with the AFL-CIO, and there was a union printer there. And he handed me a sheet of all the people that he recommends that we print with here locally in New York One on Long Island, making sure that we support local business. As a union member, I'm still a union member, even though I don't still currently work as an air traffic controller. But I believe strongly in our unions and making sure that they are represented and that they are taken care of. Because at the end of the day, that is the working class American that is going to work every day and being represented by something that I believe very strongly. So I promise you that everything that we put out has a union bug.
Just quickly, I do believe that rector's fee should be deducted. I just wasn't sure how you were asking that question to me, so I just want to make that clear. So it's a good question because all my pomp cards have a union bug. My current sign does not, and if you ask my team, they'll know I was very, very upset about that. I made it very explicitly clear I wanted a union bug on all of our signs. I went to the same AFL-CIO endorsement meeting, and I got the same list, and I was very clear that all the signs we are putting out need to have the union bug. I need to show solidarity at the very least. We are using a small local print shop out east. Anything else we put out from now on will have that union bug. I made that very clear to the team that, things happen, mistakes happen. If you own up to them and proceed forward with the right strategy and plan, then all hopefully can be rectified. But, I was very disappointed when I saw my sign. I said, that was a union bug. Well, what do you mean? You said we could use, so you could use this place if they're a union shop. But I do believe that in leadership, you have to own up to mistakes that are made. And I do think the campaign going forward, well, I do know the campaign going forward will have the union bug on all of our signs, because it's not just about checking a box and saying, okay, we have the bug, whatever. It's about fully living everything you say. And, I need to, say, I need to do what I say as well. And so that's very important to us. And going forward, it will have that union bug. As I said, I was very disappointed to find out that we had made that mistake, and it won't happen again.
Thank you, Lucas. Guys, just so you know, I'm looking at the clock myself. I think we'll go to about 8 o'clock, and we'll call it quits, and people can just mingle. Is everybody okay with that? Great, okay. One of the bigger problems in our country today, including Long Island, is gun violence. And it divides the two, or seems to divide the two parties. What are your thoughts on that, and how can it be brought under control? Lucas, you first.
I've actually brought this issue up as an issue that's very pertinent to my generation, but one that seems to have fallen by the wayside when it comes to our political rhetoric, and that is gun violence prevention. Now, I've been fortunate enough to work in organizing to this end with Students Demand Action. I was the inaugural president at NYU for that club, and what I think is really important is that our rhetoric is open to everyone. My family owns guns. They're not my favorite thing in the world, truthfully, but I've gone out shooting. It's my father was in the military. I kind of grew up in that kind of family, and so when it comes to responsible gun ownership, I find that you won't find many gun owners that want guns in the hands of the irresponsible. Yet it is once again the rhetoric and the garbage that is pushed to us by social media and all of these media platforms that is trying to divide us on this issue. And there are Republican organizations that have a vested interest in making Republicans fearful of Democrats on the issue of guns. The Democrats want to take your guns, blah blah blah. I think a lot of Democrats probably err on the side of I don't want guns in my home. I don't feel safe about this stuff, and that's a very understandable position. But they exist. There are more guns than people in this country, and the fact of the matter is, which I don't love, but the fact of the matter is that you need to make sure that Second Amendment is a right. It is a constitutional right. I think that should remain a constitutional right, but gun ownership must be protected in the sense that everyone around the gun owner needs to be protected, and the gun owner needs to be protected from oneself. And so we need red flag laws. We need to make sure that we have adequate background checks. that, we don't have loopholes like gun show loopholes where you can, okay, I can't go to the gun shop, but I can go to a gun show and I can buy an AR-15, even though I have a pattern of maybe substance abuse or domestic violence or an unhealthy mental state. These are all things that we need to close these loopholes, make sure that the gun ownership remains in the hands of the responsible gun owners so that we do not continue to have crises where our young people fear going to school, fear going to malls, fear going to public spaces, and all people, we protect our people in this country.
Thank you. Chris, I'm interested in your response because you're a military guy.
Yeah. We have the worst. We have the worst problems right now in our school when it comes to gun violence. Years ago, I remember Columbine, and that was a rarity at that point. That was big news. It is now happening almost every day in our schools. Where have we gone? We are the butt of the joke around the world. Literally, I've seen memes and movies about the United States, and they don't have drills about hurricanes, they have drills about guns. Gun violence in this country is getting to a point where it is, well, actually, it's been unacceptable for a while. It's just continuing to get worse. I am a responsible gun owner. I do shoot many weapons in the military as a member of the military. It is something that I'm still in the military, and so I still like to be proficient. However, at the same time, we do need to make sure that responsible gun owners are responsible. Not only are they responsible, but that the gun owner is properly vetted with secure and significant background checks, with those red flag laws. I've even heard of ideas where we should be having gun owners maintain insurance on their weapons for their actions. Gun ownership right now is a responsibility that should not be taken lightly. And it is something that we need to make sure that we address. I have a member of my team whose daughter was involved in a school during a shooting. So she's a part of a group called Moms Demand Action. I believe it's Moms Demand Action. So we are actually working on making sure that we work with them to enforce laws and actually pass legislation in Congress that will protect our children. Because again, our children are our future, and they should not have to worry about killing the school.
Just as a little side thought, I just want to point out that the Second Amendment says arms, not guns. And by that word, technically, you could have atomic weaponry, that sort of thing. Just a little rosy thought there. So ICE detention centers are springing up all over the country. I want to ask you about those and what can be done to keep them under control, to prevent them from springing up in our soil. I know there was some discussion about having the former IRS building in Holtzville converted into an IRS detention center, which is kind of detestable in my mind. But what do you think about that and how can it be controlled? Chris?
The fact that they want to turn that IRS building into an ICE detention center is appalling. It is right across the street from a YMCA. Literally. Our children would have to go by that all the time. And the things that occurs in front of these ICE detention facilities, not only are these ICE detention facilities completely inhumane, I mean, they are so bad they would go against the Geneva Convention rules of war. So what's going on right now in them is just completely unacceptable. We need to make sure we hold accountable the administration that is actually dealing with these ICE detention centers that are essentially torturing the people that are there. We have people in ICE detention centers that are committing suicide at rates tenfold of what they've been in years past. So these are problems and these are issues. Transparency is key. Making sure that as a congressperson, I have the ability to walk into them and actually do inspections for them if they are in the district. Hopefully we never have to deal with that. But if those are issues that we have to deal with, I will work for making sure that they are done appropriately. We should not be having these ICE detention centers. We have currently people who are American citizens that are locked up in these ICE detention centers. It is completely unacceptable and inappropriate. And I will fight every single day to make sure that, again, the administration that is dealing and making these detention centers and essentially arresting American citizens is held accountable.
You know, what we're seeing, well, what we're seeing more broadly with ICE is an immigration force that has been turned into a personal police force, you know, on the president's behest. What they're really policing now, a lot of it is dissent and speech, but you know, that problem kind of comes hand in hand with the detention center problem, which is immigration, quote unquote, focus. And what we're seeing right now is a complete destruction of due process in this country. You know, you don't need to be proven anything. You will get thrown in the slammer. You will not be fed. You will be put in conditions that would make this, you know, the skin just crawl up the back of your neck. I mean, it's disgusting. It's inhumane. The way that people are being treated in these detention centers, it's worse than animals. And, you know, what we need to see our next representative do is the complete opposite of what our Democrats in Nassau have been doing, which is continuing to fund this madness. What we're seeing, what we should be seeing rather, is our representatives pausing funding for either entirely for DHS or rather for the parts of DHS that would be funding ICE. You know, Democrats, I'm sorry, they need to start playing hardball. You know, we can't live in a fantasy world where we're going to sing Kumbaya with Republicans. They think one thing, the Republican politicians, we think a radically other thing. And what we need to do is start using our power collectively in the House and in the Senate to stop these things. We can't have a caucus of some Democrats that are saying, yeah, well, I think it's politically advantageous for me to continue to fund the dehumanization of immigrants and of protesters in this country. What we need to see is a congressional representative be headstrong and stand on 2 feet and say, enough is enough. I'm not voting for this. And as a matter of fact, I will campaign in every state, should I be the next congressman, wherever there are detention facilities, to bring the maximum awareness to the people in these districts and to the people who can, you know, actually sway their congressional representatives to do something, because this is not the country that we should be. We cannot be a country that has detention centers that treats minorities or people who dissent with the president as inhumane and as other than human. And it absolutely must stop.
My final question, and I always ask this on behalf of my wife, but you guys know what's coming. Do you have a dog, and what's its name?
I have 2 dogs. I have Charlie. He's a Havanese. He's 17 years old. I think he's waiting to see me win at the very least. That's what he keeps telling me. And he's an adorable little Havanese. And then I have Sophie, who's 5 years old. She's a Bichon Poo. And she's the energetic one. She's the one that's always like, let's go, let's do something. Where he and I like to sit and take naps together. She's a lot more energetic. So they keep me on my toes for sure.
Good answer, Lucas.
Thanks.
Chris?
I grew up with a dog my entire life. I had a Lab Husky mix, and then later on down the road, I had a Shepherd Pit Bull mix. Beautiful dog, brilliant. Unfortunately, with my deployments and traveling all around the world for whatever it might be, I just am never home and would feel real bad having to have a dog at home. So maybe one day, but not right now.
On behalf of the North Brookhaven Democratic Clubs, thank you for gracing a meeting today and for doing this. And good luck to the